They thought they could silence her with their hate, but they didn't know the woman they were attacking held the power to change their lives. And the law. It was a chilly autumn evening. The faint hum of crickets filled the air as Judge Camille Bennett stepped out of the upscale restaurant, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestone pavement. She had just finished a quiet dinner with an old friend, a rare break from her demanding schedule. Dressed in a simple black coat and carrying a leather handbag, she looked like any other professional winding down after a long day. Camille loved this part of town for its tranquility, but tonight, the stillness felt uneasy. As she approached the parking lot, she noticed a small group of young men leaning against a pickup truck near her car. Their laughter echoed through the empty street, but there was something sharp and menacing in their tone. "Hey, where you think you're going?" one of them called out as she walked past. His voice was thick with mockery, loud enough to make her stop in her tracks. Camille turned slightly, her face calm but unreadable. "Just heading to my car," she replied, her tone steady. The man Dylan stepped forward with an exaggerated laugh. "Your car? Lady, do you even know where you are?" The others chuckled, their sneers illuminated by the dim streetlight. Camille, ever the master of composure, didn't react. Instead, she took a slow step toward her car. But Dylan wasn't done. He slammed his hand on the hood of her vehicle, blocking her path. "You're dressed too nice to be around here. You sure you're not lost? Or maybe you're just borrowing this car for a little joyride?" The insinuation was clear, and it cut deeper than the crisp autumn air. Camille's fingers tightened around her keys, but her voice remained calm. "This is my car." "Excuse me." Dylan's smirk widened, his arrogance growing as his friends egged him on. "Someone call the cops. We've got a thief on our hands." The group burst into laughter. Passers-by slowed down but didn't intervene. Some whispered to each other while others avoided eye contact altogether. The scene felt surreal, the kind of moment Camille had read about in the court cases she presided over, but never imagined experiencing herself. "Listen," Camille said, her voice firm but not raised. "You don't know who I am, and I suggest you stop this before it goes too far." Dylan leaned in closer, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Oh yeah, and who exactly are you supposed to be?" Camille's expression didn't falter. She looked him square in the eye, her confidence unsettling him for a brief second. "Someone you'll regret underestimating," she replied, her tone measured. The weight of her words hung in the air, but Dylan shook it off with a scoff. "Yeah, okay," he said, dismissively waving her off. As the group continued to taunt her, Camille stayed calm. She knew this was far from over. Dylan's taunts grew louder, his voice cutting through the quiet night like a blade. "You hear that, boys? She's someone important. Must be the mayor or something." His mocking laughter set the others off, their jeers ringing in Camille's ears. Camille remained still, her heart pounding beneath her composed exterior. She knew better than to engage with their hostility. Years on the bench had taught her the power of patience and timing, even when faced with blatant disrespect. But Dylan wasn't backing down. He took a step closer, invading her space with a smirk that made Camille's stomach turn. "Or maybe," he drawled, his eyes narrowing, "you're just trying to act all high and mighty to hide what you really are." The other men exchanged knowing glances, their laughter laced with something darker. Camille's grip on her car keys tightened. She wasn't afraid. She refused to be. But she was angry. Angry that they felt so emboldened to treat her this way. Angry that the world still gave them that power. "You've had your fun," Camille said, her voice low but commanding. "Now step aside." For a moment the group hesitated. There was something about her tone that hinted at authority, something that made Dylan's smirk falter. But it didn't last long. "Lady, you don't tell us what to do," he snapped, his bravado returning in full force. "Maybe you need a little reminder of where you are." He reached for her arm, but before he could touch her, a voice rang out from the edge of the parking lot. "Hey, what's going on over here?" Everyone turned to see an older man in a maintenance uniform walking toward them, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. His weathered face was set in a frown, and there was a no-nonsense edge to his step. Dylan sneered but took a step back, raising his hands in mock innocence. "Nothing, old man. Just having a little chat." "Doesn't look like nothing to me," the man replied, his eyes flicking to Camille. "Ma'am, you all right?" Camille nodded, grateful for the brief reprieve. "I'm fine, thank you." But Dylan wasn't ready to let it go. "You don't belong here, lady," he muttered under his breath, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Better watch yourself." The maintenance worker narrowed his eyes. "I think it's time you boys moved along." For a tense moment, it seemed like Dylan might push back, but the presence of a witness, however small, was enough to dampen his bravado. With a grunt, he signaled to his friends and they reluctantly began to disperse. Camille watched them go, her shoulders still tense. She nodded her thanks to the maintenance worker and quickly unlocked her car. But as she slid into the driver's seat, she caught Dylan's glare in her rearview mirror. His lips curled into a malicious smile, and he mouthed something she couldn't hear. Camille exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. She pulled out of the parking lot, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The incident wasn't over. It was only a preview of what was to come. The judge and her wanted to call the authorities immediately to ensure justice was served. But she knew it wasn't that simple. People like Dylan didn't back down easily. They retaliated. And if they knew who she was, things could escalate further. Driving through the quiet streets, Camille couldn't shake the weight of the encounter. She had dealt with difficult people before, but this was personal. It wasn't about a courtroom or a case. It was about the sheer audacity of a group of men who saw her as less than human. As she pulled into her driveway, Camille made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let this go unanswered, not for her pride, but because people like Dylan needed to learn they couldn't act with impunity. They couldn't intimidate, humiliate, and walk away without consequences. This was far from over. The tension in the parking lot thickened like a storm ready to break. Camille stood her ground, her pulse steady, her mind sharp, while Dylan and his friends circled her like wolves sensing easy prey. Their taunts grew louder, nastier. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Dylan sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Camille remained silent, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. From a distance, Marcus, a security guard from a nearby electronics store, noticed the commotion. Marcus was a towering figure with a quiet strength about him. He had seen Camille before on TV, Judge Camille Bennett, the youngest and one of the most respected district court judges in the city. He didn't need to think twice. With purposeful strides, he made his way toward the group, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" Marcus's authoritative tone startled the group. Dylan and his friends turned to him, their smirks fading slightly. "What's it to you, man?" Dylan shot back, trying to mask his unease. Marcus's gaze was unwavering. "I work here. You're causing a scene, and it looks like you're harassing this woman. Back off." Dylan scoffed, but the confidence in his voice faltered. "We're just talking. Why don't you mind your own business?" The crowd around them began to grow. Customers exiting the stores paused to see what was happening, their murmurs growing louder. Some nodded in approval of Marcus's intervention. Others looked uneasy, unsure of what to do. Camille, still holding her composure, took note of Marcus's bravery. His intervention gave her the space to think clearly. Dylan's friends, emboldened by the audience, started jeering at Marcus, accusing him of picking the wrong side. One of them laughed bitterly. "What, are you her bodyguard now?" Marcus didn't flinch. "I don't care who she is. I care about what's right, and what you're doing isn't." Camille decided it was time to act. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Without raising her voice, she spoke clearly and calmly. "I'm calling the police." Her words cut through the air like a sharp blade. Dylan froze for a moment before breaking into nervous laughter. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "Go ahead. Let's see who they believe." Unfazed, Camille pressed the call button. "Yes, I'd like to report an incident," she began, her voice steady. The crowd grew quieter, their eyes darting between Camille and the group of thugs. Marcus stood beside her, his presence a silent message to Dylan and his friends. "This isn't going to end the way you think." Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. A squad car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene. Dylan's bravado returned, and he stepped forward with exaggerated confidence. "Thank God you're here, officers," he said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "This woman and that guy over there were causing all kinds of trouble." Camille didn't say a word. She simply watched, her expression calm yet unreadable. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Camille gave him a subtle shake of her head. She had a plan. One of the officers approached Camille and Marcus, asking for their IDs and accounts of what happened. Camille reached into her bag and handed over her identification. The officer's eyes widened as he read it. His posture straightened and his tone shifted immediately. "Judge Bennett," he said, his voice laced with respect and surprise. I, I didn't realize." Camille nodded politely. "Thank you for responding quickly. I'll answer any questions you have." Meanwhile, Dylan continued his tirade, unaware of the officer's realization. "She started it," he insisted, gesturing wildly. "And that guy? He just jumped in like some wannabe hero." The second officer joined his partner, who handed him Camille's ID. They exchanged a look before one of them turned back to Dylan. "Sir, we need you to stay where you are. This is Judge Camille Bennett of the District Court." The color drained from Dylan's face. His friends, who had been smirking moments earlier, looked like they wanted to disappear. Camille finally stepped forward, her voice steady but commanding. "Officers, I'd like to provide my statement. These individuals accosted me unprovoked. They escalated the situation and attempted to intimidate both me and this gentleman who intervened." The officers nodded, their demeanor shifting entirely in her favor. Dylan tried to speak, but his words were jumbled. We didn't know." Camille fixed him with a calm, piercing gaze. "No, you didn't. And that's exactly the problem." The officers began questioning Dylan and his friend separately, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in for them. Camille stepped aside to speak privately with Marcus, who looked both relieved and impressed. "You handled that well," Marcus said, his deep voice warm. "So did you," Camille replied with a small smile. "Thank you for stepping in. That took courage." The scene slowly began to settle, but the consequences for Dylan and his friends were just beginning. The air was heavy with tension as the police continued separating everyone into groups for questioning. Dylan's smug confidence wavered, but he tried to hold on to his bravado. His friends glanced nervously at each other, clearly unsure of what to do. Camille stood a short distance away, calm and composed. She observed as one officer approached her again, this time with a softer demeanor. "Judge Bennett," he said quietly, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry about this misunderstanding. We'll get it sorted out." Camille nodded graciously. "I trust you will. I'd also like to submit a formal statement once this is settled." Meanwhile, Dylan was frantically trying to spin his version of events to the other officer. "She was aggressive," he lied, his voice cracking slightly. "And that guy," he pointed at Marcus, "jumped in out of nowhere. They were causing a scene." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Causing a scene? Several witnesses have already told us it was the other way around." "Witnesses?" Dylan blurted, panic creeping into his voice. He glanced around at the gathering crowd. Whispers and pointed stares surrounded him, making it impossible to ignore the weight of the truth closing in. Marcus, standing quietly nearby, locked eyes with Dylan. His expression said it all. "You've lost, and you know it." When the officers finally asked for everyone's identification, the moment Camille had been waiting for arrived. She reached into her bag, pulled out her ID, and handed it over. The officer who had approached her earlier took one glance and froze. He blinked, then looked up at her with wide eyes. "Your Honor," he said, his tone filled with awe and embarrassment. I had no idea." His partner stepped forward, curious about the reaction. The first officer handed him Camille's ID, and within seconds they both exchanged an unspoken realization. "Wait," Dylan muttered, noticing the officer's change in attitude. "What's going on?" Camille decided it was time to end the charade. She stepped forward, her voice steady and authoritative. "Allow me to introduce myself," she said, her words slicing through the tension like a blade. "I am Judge Camille Bennett of the District Court." The silence was deafening. Dylan's face went pale, and his friends looked like they wanted to disappear. Kyle, the loudest of Dylan's friends earlier, let out a nervous laugh. "Yeah, right," he scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's a judge, and I'm the president." Without missing a beat, Camille pulled a sleek leather folder from her bag and opened it. Inside was a formal letter confirming her judicial title, complete with an official seal. She handed it to the officer, who held it up for everyone to see. The crowd gasped. Dylan stumbled backward, his arrogance crumbling into panic. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "That much is clear," Camille replied coldly, her gaze unwavering. Kyle muttered under his breath, "We didn't mean any harm." Camille tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor unnerving them further. No harm, she repeated. You tried to humiliate me, intimidate me, and when that didn't work, you lied to the police. Actions have consequences, gentlemen. The officers, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, turned to Dylan and Kyle. You're under arrest, one of them said firmly. Charges include harassment and attempted theft. What? Dylan shrieked as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. This isn't fair. The officer didn't flinch. Fair? Let's talk about fair when you're in front of a judge. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As Dylan and Kyle were led toward the police car, their friends remained frozen in place, unsure whether to stay or run. The officers gave them warnings but didn't arrest them, clearly considering their involvement minimal. Camille turned her attention back to Marcus. Thank you for stepping in earlier. Your courage didn't go unnoticed. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to praise. I just did what anyone should do. No, Camille said firmly. You did what too many people wouldn't, and that makes all the difference. The crowd, now dispersing, murmured in agreement. Many glanced at Camille with a mixture of admiration and respect, realizing they had just witnessed something remarkable. As the last squad car drove away, Camille took a deep breath. The storm had passed, but its impact was just beginning. The air outside the precinct was crisp as Camille stood silently, watching the patrol car carrying Dylan and Kyle disappear into the distance. A sense of resolution settled over the scene, but the emotions swirling in the crowd were far from over. The officers who remained on site approached Camille with a newfound respect. One of them, Officer Jennings, tipped his hat slightly. Your Honor, I deeply apologize for what you just experienced. I can't imagine how difficult that was. Camille's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. Difficult, yes. Surprising? Number. She folded her arms, looking directly at the officer. It's exactly why we have to do better. In the courtroom, on the streets, everywhere. Officer Jennings nodded solemnly, visibly absorbing her words. We'll make sure this case is handled properly, he assured her. I'm counting on you, Camille replied. Nearby, Marcus stood awkwardly, his hands shoved in his pockets, as if unsure of what to do now that the moment was over. Camille approached him with a warm smile. Marcus, she began, what you did today wasn't just brave. It was honorable. Thank you for stepping in when you didn't have to. Marcus shook his head, the humility evident in his every movement. I just couldn't stand there and let them keep going. It wasn't right. And that's exactly why your actions matter, Camille said firmly. You could have walked away like so many others might have, but you chose to act. That makes all the difference. She extended her hand and Marcus hesitated for a brief moment before shaking it. The onlookers who had lingered clapped quietly, the sound growing as others joined in. Marcus's face turned red, but Camille made sure the recognition landed. As the group dispersed, Camille noticed Dylan's friends still loitering nearby, their postures stiff and awkward. One of them, visibly shaken, shuffled forward. Judge Bennett? He stammered, his voice trembling. We didn't mean for it to go this far. You just stood there, Camille interrupted, her tone cutting but not unkind. You didn't throw the punches, but you didn't stop them either. Silence has consequences, too. The young man swallowed hard, nodding in understanding. I'm sorry, he murmured. Camille's expression softened slightly. Don't tell me, she said. Do better. Show up for the right reasons next time. The young man nodded again, his shoulders sagging as he walked away with his friends. The officers wrapped up their reports and prepared to leave, but not before one of them returned Camille's bag. Your Honor, Officer Jennings said with a faint smile, this belongs to you, and I'm happy to say nothing's missing. Thank you, Camille replied, accepting it with a nod. As the crowd finally dispersed and quiet returned to the street, Camille stood for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle. Marcus approached her one last time, his voice hesitant. Do you think they'll really learn from this? He asked. Camille glanced at him, a flicker of determination in her eyes. That's not something we can guarantee, she said, but what matters is that we've held them accountable. And sometimes that's enough to plant the seed of change. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his respect for Camille evident. Later that evening, back at home, Camille sat at her desk, reviewing the day's events in her mind. The anger, the fear, the resilience. It all seemed to blur together into one vivid memory. She picked up her pen and began writing a statement for the court, detailing every action, every word, and every emotion. This wasn't just about justice for herself. It was about making sure the system worked for everyone, especially those who didn't have the privilege of a title to protect them. She paused for a moment, staring at the paper. Then, with a deep breath, she wrote one final line. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet resolve to stand up for what's right. The next morning, Camille woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly. Messages, missed calls, and notifications flooded her screen. Confused, she scrolled through the text from friends and colleagues. "You're all over the news, Camille. Have you seen the video? You're a hero. Call me. We need to talk about this." Her heart raced as she clicked on a link sent by her colleague. It opened to a local news website with a bold headline, "Judge Camille Bennett confronts racism head-on." Below it was a grainy video, clearly shot on a phone, capturing the confrontation from the previous day. The footage wasn't perfect, but it told the story vividly. Dylan's mocking laughter, Marcus stepping in, and Camille's composed authority as she revealed her identity. It was all there. The comments section beneath the video was a whirlwind of emotions. This is exactly what's wrong with our society. People like Dylan think they can get away with anything. Judge Bennett is a class act. She handled this with such grace. Marcus deserves a medal. We need more people like him. Camille sighed. She hadn't anticipated the incident would gain so much attention, but there it was, spreading like wildfire. Later that morning, Camille received a call from her assistant, Lauren. "Judge Bennett, you're trending," Lauren said, half laughing. "Every local news outlet is talking about what happened. Even some national channels are picking it up." "What?" Camille asked, still in disbelief. "They're calling you the unshakable judge. People are praising how you handled everything. And Marcus? People are saying he's a hero." Camille smiled faintly. "He is," she said softly. By noon, the media frenzy was in full swing. News trucks lined the street outside her home, reporters eager for a statement. Camille knew she couldn't avoid the spotlight forever, but she wanted to make sure her message was clear. She opened her laptop and began drafting a short public statement. Yesterday's incident was a painful reminder of the biases that still exist in our society. While I am grateful for the support I've received, this is not just my story. It's about addressing the systemic issues that allow prejudice to persist. I hope this moment sparks a conversation about how we treat one another, both in our communities and beyond. Camille hit post and immediately saw the flood of responses. Supportive messages poured in, thanking her for her bravery and leadership. Meanwhile, the local news stations interviewed community leaders and residents about the incident. One segment featured Marcus, who appeared visibly uncomfortable in front of the camera, but spoke with sincerity. "I just did what anyone should do," Marcus said humbly. "We've got to stand up for what's right, no matter how small the action seems." His words resonated with viewers, and soon Marcus became a local hero in his own right. At the same time, the community's outrage toward Dylan and Kyle reached a boiling point. Social media users dug up their online profiles, exposing a pattern of hateful comments and aggressive behavior. Public pressure mounted with calls for them to face the consequences of their actions. Camille, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. In an interview later that week, she emphasized the need for education and accountability. "This isn't about shaming two individuals," she said firmly. "It's about addressing the attitudes and beliefs that allow this kind of behavior to thrive. Change begins with acknowledgement, and it continues through action." Her words struck a chord, inspiring others to share their own experiences with discrimination. Stories began flooding local news outlets and social media, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the original incident. Dylan and Kyle, meanwhile, remained silent as public opinion turned against them. Their families issued statements condemning their behavior, and community leaders called for greater awareness of hate crimes. Camille's actions also caught the attention of advocacy groups, who reached out to collaborate on initiatives to combat racial bias. Within weeks, she found herself at the center of a growing movement, using her platform to raise awareness and push for meaningful change. One evening, as Camille walked home from a community event, a young girl approached her timidly. "Are you Judge Bennett?" the girl asked, her wide eyes filled with awe. Camille knelt down to meet her gaze. "I am. What's your name?" "Kayla," the girl replied. "I saw your video. You're so brave. I want to be just like you when I grow up." Camille smiled, her heart swelling with pride and responsibility. "Thank you, Kayla. And I want you to grow up knowing you can make a difference no matter what." As Camille walked away, she realized the weight of her actions. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about inspiring others to stand tall, to speak out, and to believe in a future where respect and equality were the norm. The courtroom was quiet as Dylan and Kyle sat at the defendant's table, their heads lowered. The weight of their actions seemed to press down on them like a heavy cloak. Facing charges of harassment and theft, they were no longer the smug, arrogant men who had confronted Camille that day. Now they looked cornered, as though the reality of their choices was finally sinking in. Camille wasn't presiding over the case. She had chosen to let another judge handle it to avoid any conflict of interest. Instead, she watched from the gallery, her expression calm yet unreadable. She had no desire for vengeance, but she knew that justice had to be served. The prosecutor laid out the facts meticulously. Video evidence, eyewitness accounts, and Dylan's own words on record painted a damning picture. The court murmured when the prosecutor replayed the footage of Dylan and Kyle mocking Camille and grabbing her belongings. When it was time for the defense to speak, Dylan's lawyer presented a statement. "My client deeply regrets his actions. He was not aware of Judge Bennett's position and acted out of character." Camille's eyebrow arched slightly. Out of character? Or just unmasked, she thought. Dylan was called to the stand next. He shuffled awkwardly, avoiding Camille's gaze as he fumbled with his prepared statement. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to cause harm. I made a mistake, and I'll work to do better." The apology landed flat. It was as though the words had been rehearsed but lacked genuine remorse. The courtroom remained silent, the tension palpable. Kyle's turn was no better. His apology was riddled with excuses, blaming peer pressure, and claiming he had no intention of causing harm. Camille sighed inwardly. The lack of accountability was evident. The judge, stern and deliberate, delivered the verdict. Guilty. Dylan and Kyle were sentenced to community service and required to attend a rehabilitation program focused on understanding racial bias and the impact of hate crimes. It wasn't a harsh punishment, but it was enough to send a message. Later that day, Camille found herself approached by reporters outside the courthouse. "Judge Bennett, how do you feel about the outcome?" one asked. Camille paused, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't just about one moment or two individuals," she said. "It's about addressing the attitudes that fuel this kind of behavior. Accountability is a step, but education and growth are just as important." The reporters nodded, scribbling furiously. Camille hoped her words would redirect the focus from punishment to progress. A week later, to everyone's surprise, Dylan's family arranged for him to issue a public apology. In a televised interview, he faced the camera with a scripted statement. "I've reflected on my actions, and I deeply regret the harm I caused. I want to apologize to Judge Bennett and everyone I disrespected. I'm committed to learning and becoming a better person." The apology received mixed reactions. Some viewers saw it as an attempt to save face, while others hoped it signaled genuine change. Camille, watching from home, couldn't help but feel skeptical, but she reminded herself that growth took time. Inspired by the incident, Camille launched a local initiative called the Bridge Project. Its mission was to educate young people about prejudice, respect, and accountability. Schools, community centers, and even businesses invited Camille to speak, her words leaving a lasting impact on everyone who listened. Through her initiative, she connected with people like Marcus, who became an advocate for standing up against hate. Together, they held workshops, fostering conversations that weren't always easy but were absolutely necessary. One evening, Marcus joined Camille at a community event. As they looked out at the crowd filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, Marcus turned to her and said, "You've turned something ugly into something beautiful." Camille smiled, a mix of gratitude and determination in her eyes. We did, she replied, and we're just getting started. The auditorium buzzed with life as hundreds of students and community members gathered, eager to hear from Judge Camille Bennett. The spotlight illuminated the stage, where Camille stood confidently, her presence commanding yet approachable. She adjusted the microphone, looking out at the sea of young faces. Some were curious, others inspired, and a few seemed skeptical. But that was why she was here, to plant seeds of understanding and change. Good evening, she began, her voice calm but resolute. A few months ago, I found myself in a situation that tested everything I believed in. I was judged, not for my qualifications, not for my actions, but for how I looked. That experience reminded me of something powerful. Real change starts with how we choose to act in those moments. The room fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. Camille went on to share the story of that fateful day with candor, weaving in moments of reflection and lessons learned. She didn't just recount the incident. She invited the audience to step into her shoes, to feel the sting of judgment and the triumph of resilience. She paused, looking directly at a young girl in the front row. To those of you who've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or unseen, know this: your worth is not up for debate, and your voice has power. Use it. The applause was thunderous, but Camille's work didn't stop there. Through her initiative, the Bridge Project, she had begun to dismantle prejudice one conversation at a time. Schools partnered with her to implement diversity and inclusion workshops, and businesses sought her advice on creating fairer workplaces. Marcus, the security guard who had stepped in that day, became one of her most vocal advocates. He led sessions on allyship, sharing his story with passion. At a citywide ceremony, Marcus was honored with the Courage Award for his bravery. Camille sat in the front row, clapping the loudest. When Marcus accepted his award, he looked directly at her and said, "This is for everyone who chooses to stand up, even when it's hard." Thank you, Judge Bennett, for teaching me that courage doesn't need a badge or a title. It just needs heart. The incident also left a profound impact on Dylan and Kyle, though their paths were different. Kyle kept a low profile after serving his sentence, but Dylan eventually sought redemption. Months after his public apology, he approached Camille privately, asking to volunteer with the Bridge Project. "I want to do better," he said, his voice sincere for the first time. Camille looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "The first step to change," she said, "is owning your mistakes. Let's see what you can do." Dylan's involvement sparked controversy at first, but over time, he became an example of how accountability could lead to growth. In one workshop, he shared, "I thought strength was about power and control, but I've learned that real strength is in respect and understanding." The ripple effects didn't stop there. The local community rallied around the Bridge Project, raising funds to expand its reach. Camille's story continued to inspire headlines and social media discussions. People from across the country shared their own experiences of bias and resilience, creating a movement of solidarity. One afternoon, Camille walked into her bank, the same branch where the incident had occurred. This time, she was greeted warmly. The staff had undergone training, and a new motto hung proudly on the wall: "Respect is our policy." As Camille left the bank, she noticed a group of teens chatting nearby. One of them glanced at her and said, "Hey, isn't that the judge from the news? The one who stood up to those guys?" Camille smiled to herself, her heart full. The change wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had listened, learned, and chosen to be better. Real power, she thought, wasn't about titles or appearances. It was about creating a legacy that inspired others to act with kindness, courage, and respect.